Welcome back. New messaging from Iran is calling for the shedding of blood from Israelis and President Trump.
It's one of the few official statements from the country's leaders as it faces a combined airstrike campaign from Israel and the United States.
The statement aired on Iranian state television saying, quote, "We are now on the verge of the great test, and we must be careful to fully preserve this unity, to fully preserve this alliance." It went on to call for the shedding of Zionist blood, the shedding of Trump's blood, and that Iran would, quote, "fight the oppressive America." Meanwhile, Iran launched a new wave of attacks overnight at Israeli and American bases. Leaders say the United States would bitterly regret torpedoing an Iranian warship in the Indian Ocean. Joining us live now to talk about the latest international developments, Dr. Naven Boppat, professor of international relations and the chair of the Department of Political Science at UNC Chapel Hill. Good morning, Naven. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start here with the recent developments and also what we have not heard from the administration or Israel as to what comes next after this. What are you making of the most recent stuff we're seeing from the Middle East?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So it is a bit unclear as to what the objectives of the administration are. So in the initial stages of this campaign, there was discussion of regime change. That seems to have been walked back to focusing on disarming the Iranian state, to ensuring that they don't have any air capacity, any naval capacity, and any missile capacity. So and to make sure that they don't develop a nuclear weapon, so they have no ability to move forward with that, should they choose to do so. So I think it's changed from complete regime change to some effort to just disarm them. Though there are reports that the U.S. might be trying to support some Kurdish forces. I don't know how deep that is, but again, it looks like the sort of objectives of the administration are a bit in flux. So it is hard to sort of say what exactly is coming next.
Naven, let's kind of play this out, right? So we heard yesterday Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth saying that the U.S. is going to continue to apply pressure, maybe more now than what we've seen in the first 4 or 5 days of Operation Epic Fury. Let's say that they wave the white flag and that they say that's it, no more. How do we actually help implement a new regime? Because we're hearing that the Ayatollah's son could be next. Israel's certainly not going for that. So how do we actually get the change on the back end of the conflict?
Yeah, and I think the president said also that many of the senior leadership that could have potentially filled the void of Khamenei were killed in the initial strikes. So that does make the task of trying to establish new leadership difficult. So I think there's two tracks, right? On one hand, what the administration could do, which I think was the favored plan, was to try to find someone in the administration that could basically take the reins of power, not have a complete regime change, and would cooperate with both the United States and Israel. Though, again, the president said many of those leaders that could potentially fill that role were killed. And what we do know, again, is that Iran seems to have reached out after the bombing, though their public posture is hostile, of course. Again, there does seem to be some effort to try to get some settlement there. The other possibility is that the United States could support a popular uprising to try to overthrow the Iranian state. The U.S. has seemed to encourage that, though, again, that's not consistent with the first strategy. So, again, and that could potentially be a bargaining tactic where they try to leverage to threaten some of the current leadership that if they don't cooperate with the U.S. and Israeli objectives, then maybe they'll support a popular uprising. So it's not really clear kind of what the end state is going to be. And also, either of these things are not necessarily predictable, right? So if another leader comes into power, that's probably more predictable than if there's a popular uprising. But we don't know what that leader's preferences will actually be, and we don't know if the leader will say things at one point and then change them. So anytime this is attempted, there is sort of this cone of uncertainty that does exist.
Naven, I'm going to ask you to take the pulse of perhaps the Iranian people. We talk about that popular uprising. We know that they were protesting for months against their own government. What do they want to see? What do the masses in Iran want to see in terms of their leadership?
That's a great question. So I don't have a perfect answer for it because I don't know. I haven't seen any polling or I haven't seen any sort of real analysis of Iran after the war. But what we can say, based on the popular uprising and based on information we had, and based on some feeds that are coming out of Iran, is that it seems like the people are squeezed. Right. So on one hand, the Iranian state is not a popular regime. Right. And if we just look at the economic performance of it, and the protests against it, it's pretty clear that this is not a state that is beloved by most of the Iranian people. And so in some instances, there may be some welcome for the overthrow of the state. But on the other hand, there seems to be very little desire of the Iranian people to work with the United States or Israel because of the deep distrust that exists between Iran and those states and given history. So I think they feel squeezed. Actually, I don't know. It doesn't seem to, they don't seem to have a really good answer here, because even if the regime were to continue after the Ayatollah, probably it would be someone that's similar. So there really doesn't seem to be many good options for the Iranian people.
Navin, one of the things you're really good at doing is looking at the ripple effects of what happens here. So you mentioned the last time we spoke to you, removing the head of the snake, right? So what happens to these other factions, Hezbollah, Hamas, which we know is very weakened? If, say, there's a regime change in Iran, does that essentially mean these other terrorist organizations don't have funding anymore and don't have backing? What happens to them and Israel's fight against them?
Well, I think that would be something that Israel would want from whatever new leader comes into power. They would probably ask for a cessation of support to Hamas and Hezbollah, though both of those organizations are already quite weakened. So they're already in trouble. And so if they were to lose an ally in Iran, or even if Iran has to devote more resources towards fighting for its survival, which it obviously has to do now, both of those organizations are again in trouble. And they already were, and now they're probably in more trouble as a result of the attacks on Iran. The one organization that's still maybe somewhat more functional are the Houthi in Yemen. There wasn't any sign of significant weakening like there was of them, like there was with Hezbollah and Hamas. But if that organization is supported by Iran, and it is, again, it's a matter of time, especially because Iran likely needs those munitions to defend itself.
All right, Dr. Navin Bhapat, Chair Political Science at UNC Chapel Hill. Navin, as always, we thank you for your time. And again, I'm sure we'll be talking sooner rather than later, unfortunately. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Queen City News Plus. Just search Queen City News on your smart TV's app store.